Two conflicts are raging right now in Central Africa that are killing thousands, tens of thousands of people, displacing millions. You won't hear much about them from most media outlets. There's very little coverage of it, perhaps in part because the Obama administration so far seems completely incapable of doing much of anything to try to stem the bloodshed, to try to push back this tide of violence and anarchy in two countries not far from each other, both in Africa. First, let's break down what they are. We have the Central African Republic, we have the South Sudan. We can show you where those are on a map here. You see the CAR, we've talked to you about that before on this show, and South Sudan, the newest country in the world, broken from what had been the Sudan in 2011. That is also a country now that is in the midst of a low-grade civil war, the beginnings of what could be a full-fledged conflagration in that country. Now, let's start with one and we'll move on to the other. In the Central African Republic, you have 1,000 killed is the official number, definitely low. There's very little good reporting coming out of that country. You have 958,000 displaced, also probably on the low side. And this fighting is largely between Christians and Muslims. A Muslim government took power. It's a predominantly Christian country. And then there was fighting between the Silika militias, and now Christian militias have formed to fight against them. So it has become a sectarian conflict. We can show you that at the airport, in fact, there are 100,000 displaced people living just there alone. They're living in camps and in tent-like circumstances. The UN has been able to pass out food there for the first time in 4 weeks in the past couple of days. Now, the CAR's president, Michael Jatodia, he resigned after peace talks. That's the latest news that's coming out. That's been required in some of the negotiations going on there. That's one conflict. Again, Muslim-Christian violence, thousands and thousands being killed. The level of viciousness and bloodshed is something that is hard to describe to you now, but it involves decapitations, lynchings, torture, rapes, murders. Everything that you can imagine is going on in that country. Now, in the South Sudan, there's also a conflict there, and that is 10,000 killed so far, 200,000 displaced. Again, these numbers are going to be on the low end, and it's fighting between government and rebel forces. Now, it's a new government, it's a new country. It's only been around since 2011. This may have come up on radar screens, by the way, for folks, because that there were actually some U.S. soldiers, 4 Navy SEALs, were injured in an Osprey aircraft that was trying to evacuate U.S. personnel from the South Sudan. They were shot at by ground fire. They were wounded. No U.S. Navy SEALs were killed, but that's what got that in the news here. There's a power struggle going on there. I want to get more into the details of this, but before we get too far into the weeds, I want to bring in an expert to help us work through these issues. Joining us now is Gillan Turner. She served in the White House National Security Council and currently works at a national strategy firm where her regional focus is Africa. Gillian, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Buck. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the CAR, the Central African Republic, Gillian. Last we checked in, it was essentially into a spiral of sectarian violence, bloodshed getting worse and worse. We know there are 1,600 French troops on the ground. We know that under the UN mandate, 6,000 African troops are supposed to be joining them. Is that possibly enough to quell the violence here? What's happening on the ground to try to get this thing to at least get the combatants to pull back from all-out war?
I think that what this really can best be characterized as is a test of how well U.S. humanitarian intervention coupled with military intervention headed by international organizations can work in these types of situations. Africa seems to be the first test cases in the new year. I think one way to characterize what's been going on in the Central African Republic is that we're seeing political violence with undertones really of religious violence. We're seeing, as you mentioned, Muslims pitted against Christians, while in South Sudan, what we're seeing is politically motivated violence as well, for sure, but we have more sort of tribal sectarian undertones here. We're seeing the two main tribes in the country, the Dinka and the Nuer, posed and pitted against one another. The last month has been incredibly brutal on both fronts. The situation since we last spoke inside the car has deteriorated to the point of seeming hopelessness. We have 1,000 new people, 1,000 more people dead since September. We have a few hundred, since December, excuse me, we have a few 100,000 more displaced. Likewise, inside South Sudan, we're looking at thousands internally displaced, with thousands fleeing the borders into neighboring countries like Uganda and Kenya. seeking
Tara, I
refugee
know you wanted to
status
speak. You wanted to ask Gillian about the South Sudan specifically.
I did. So Gillian, you bring up South Sudan, which is the world's youngest country. The U.S. was involved and heralded that country and their independence as an achievement. That was only a few years ago. What has happened there? And what does that mean for our relationship with the South Sudan? Are we going to have more boots on the ground to rescue them? But what happened there that the situation deteriorated so quickly?
Well, what's happened in the last couple of years, the CPA was the accord by which the South Sudanese seceded from Sudan and became its own country, has been in effect for about 2.5 years now. And what we've seen is that whereas before we had a divide in the country between North and South, Muslim and Christian, what we're now seeing is that the predominantly Christian South is experiencing this tribal division. It's very unclear exactly what the situation is on the ground, as Buck mentioned before, but what is being said is that the President Salva Kiir has accused his former vice president and arch rival of sort of stirring up a coup. And we've seen that retaliatory strikes are happening throughout the country, not just in a single location, but really metastasizing.
This is another example, guys, of the administration essentially just playing it on the sidelines, not really doing very much at all. I have a quote here from President Obama in 2011, as we said, that we were very involved in the creation of this country, South Sudan. And after so much struggle by the people of South Sudan, the United States of America welcomes the birth of a new nation. Together, we can ensure that today marks another step forward in Africa's long journey toward opportunity, democracy, and justice. Juxtapose that with December 24th reporting from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in the same country that there's mass extrajudicial killings, targeting of individuals on the basis of their ethnicity, mass graves, and there are reportedly there are other mass graves that are being discovered every day.
Can I just say something I think that's actually a missed story or something that hasn't been reported on much in relation to this is, especially if you take into account the Central African Republic, is that the French seem to be the new interventionists on the global scene. They intervened in Mali to oust Islamist.
Yeah, Africa is their backyard,
right? But it's I think someone
again,
who
I should say,
and again these are former colonies of theirs, so there are certainly cultural and historical ties. But I think it's someone like me who's pretty non-interventionist. I'm sort of reassured that the French, who I don't think can any longer be called seriously cheese-eating surrender monkeys, are the ones who are going out and putting boots on the ground and trying to halt these humanitarian crises.
You see that as dissuading us from actually getting involved because we have another...
Well, I think what the French have demonstrated is that actually with a lot of international support and international cooperation and with international bodies agreeing that the intervention is probably a good thing, can do it without having any sort of this nation-building nonsense that have got us in so much trouble in the last decade.
Yeah, and I think Gillian made an important point talking about how there are a lot of different tensions in these conflicts. She said that there's a religious conflict with Muslims and Christians, targeting one another, but there's also these kind of tribal conflicts.
One another.
What?
I said not targeting one another. The Muslims are targeting Christians.
Well, but the other part of it is that she's talking about tribal conflicts and how that's much more difficult to identify. And to your question, Tara, how do we move forward after I presume thought that this was a country that was somewhat stable, if these are the kind of conflicts that are going to boil up, a few years after their genesis?
Yeah, I mean, just a year and a half ago when I was with Congress, I was invited to go to the South Sudan. I didn't go, but this was just a year and a half ago, and now we're evacuating our embassy.
Gillian, I want to bring you back in here because, as we've discussed before with you, you have several Africanists, people who have made their careers studying Africa, working Africa within the government, in very senior government positions. You, of course, have Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor. She is somebody who has spent a lot of time working on Africa. You also have Samantha Power, who is the author of the R2P doctrine that got us into Libya, saying we cannot allow, never again, genocide to happen. You've got the UN Commissioner for Human Rights saying there's mass graves. And all I've seen so far recently from Ambassador Rice is the United States calls upon rebel leader Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir to sign immediately the cessation of hostilities agreement. What if they don't? What is all of this humanitarian stuff that they've been talking about in this administration for the past 5 years?
The other reality, Buck, I have to bring this up, is that it's always very easy to point a finger at the United States, right? And say, where is the United States? They're not doing anything. And this is, in fact, a famous a famously enjoyed pastime of corrupt African leaders. And so I'm always very hesitant to jump on the bandwagon of sort of finger wagging at any U.S. administration in these types of issues. The reality is that the United States is working through the United Nations, through its role on the UN Security Council, to try and sort of mediate and mitigate the circumstances. However, at the same time, we've seen some efforts, some considerable efforts in recent weeks on the part of the administration to move beyond this sort of limited role and really try and prove the efficacy of humanitarian intervention. As I said before, in concert with military intervention led by international organizations. It's not a proven concept.
Quickly to your point about non-intervention, it's one thing to make the case for non-intervention, but to have an administration full of people that have said that this is exactly what they will never allow to happen and built entire careers on it, that is hypocrisy. Right. That is my problem. I'm not saying we should land the Marines. I'm just saying that the people that are running this government are doing nothing after becoming very famous and powerful, talking about exactly this issue. But Gillian, Gillian, always good to see you. We got to leave it there for now, but thank you for sharing your expertise. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
The Friday edition of Misfit Stories coming up.